Welcome to this online lesson on London in the Second World War. Taking shelter. What protection was available for London citizens? This first photograph shows a Morrison Shelter, a steel cage that was used as a table in the house by the day and a shelter by night. The image was produced in a test by the government to reassure people who used them. How successful would this image be in reassuring users of the Morrison shelters? Explain your opinion. Pause the video now while you attempt that task. Well, first of all, notice the damage that has been done. The ceiling, or perhaps the floor above, has collapsed on top of the Morrison shelter, and yet it has not buckled at all. It has remained sturdy and it has remained secure. In addition, look at all the brick rubble to the left. None of that has actually entered the shelter itself. In fact, the worst thing that seems to have happened to the sandbags inside the shelter is they've got covered in a fine layer of dust. Very survivable. Now, perhaps it might be a little bit less reassuring, showing the sort of damage that could happen to your house. However, by the time this image was produced, many Londoners were quite realistic about the risks of living through the Blitz, so that wouldn't have been a surprise. Most of them had seen bomb sites before and seen bombed out families. What might be more reassuring, though, is that this otherwise quite functional piece of furniture could be a life-saving device, if used properly. I doubt it was that comfortable, though. Also, imagine how terrifying it would have been being trapped inside a building inside this steel cage. Nevertheless, the Morrison shelter was a reasonably popular type of shelter, but not one of the more famous types. Let's consider some of the other precautions that were taken in relation to the Blitz. Let's consider the issue of the fear of gas attack. In 1939, memories of the horrors of gas in World War II were still very fresh. The government began a process of issuing gas masks to the public in September of 1938, during the Munich crisis. Although war was averted at that particular time, people weren't to realise that a year later the war would have started. People weren't to know, but gas was never actually used in raids in World War II, but they felt the need to prepare for it. There were adult masks, one is shown to the top right, baby masks, one is shown just below that, and even children's masks made to look a little bit like Mickey Mouse. But not just like Mickey Mouse, this is an utterly nightmarish version of Mickey Mouse that will now haunt your every waking moment. Look at the state of that. That is a massive, massive pile of nope, and I want nothing to do with it. Okay, I'll cover it up in a moment. So your tasks are, phew, that's better. 1. What was the percentage drop in gas mask carrying between A, September 1939 and November 1939, and then B, November 1939 and March 1940? 2. What might explain this drop? Lastly, civilians were told to carry their gas masks at all times, so why didn't they? Pause the video now and have a go at those tasks. Okay, ready? Well, first of all, the percentage drops. What you need to do is 70% minus 34% should give you 36% for your first go. And then 34% minus 1%, well, I think that's pretty easy as well. 33% drop until March 1940. So that's a huge drop, isn't it, from the vast majority of people carrying one to actually a tiny minority. What might explain it? Well, remember that by March 1940, the gas attacks hadn't actually happened. People had become weary of this, and they just didn't see the point in carrying the gas masks around anymore. They had, if you like, become complacent. But civilians were still being ordered to carry their gas masks, so why wouldn't they? Well, quite simply, they couldn't be bothered. I mean, look at that top picture there. That is a bulky item, reasonably heavy, and it's in that rubbish little cardboard box. Imagine how easily that could get broken. Imagine how inconvenient that is to carry around. Well, an awful lot of people thought that they just wouldn't bother carrying them around unless the risk of gas attacks seemed to increase. Nevertheless, it's incredible, isn't it, that so many millions of these gas masks were produced. They can still be found in many homes around the country where people have kept them as souvenirs after the war. But be warned, never wear one of these gas masks. The gas filter on the front was made from asbestos, which degrades over time and is now an incredibly dangerous thing to breathe in. So by all means have a look at them, but definitely never put them on. And what about that Mickey Mouse one? I mean, I would be very tempted to kill that with fire, but I suppose it's a historical artefact, so I really shouldn't. Air raid shelter types. Since World War I, few houses had been built with underground cellars. They'd sort of gone out of fashion. The government needed to provide shelters and, where possible, kept them above ground. This was to encourage people to leave them and to go to work in the morning. At this stage, it should be realised that the government rather underestimated how strong people would be in the face of bombing. They also encouraged them to be dispersed, so that not too many people would be killed by a direct hit. Here's the first and probably the most famous type of air raid shelter, the Anderson Shelter, named after its designer. Provided by the council and built in the garden from corrugated iron and earth. However, these were built partially underground, and so they often flooded in the rain, which made them unpopular in some respects. But if you couldn't afford to buy one, they were usually free. Second is the domestic surface shelter. These were brick-built, usually by wealthier families in their own garden. These would have been built at their own expense. Some of these shelters are now used as garden sheds, like the one pictured. Thirdly, basements. I haven't included a picture of that one. Basements were where blocks of flats or houses had cellars and basements. These could be used as shelters. However, they weren't necessarily as safe as it might seem. If the building above collapsed into the basement, that was the end of that. Next, communal and public service shelters. Usually made from brick and concrete, built by councils and placed in the middle of the streets. These were not popular. They felt very exposed being in the middle of the streets above ground, and it would have been incredibly noisy during an air raid to be inside one of them. Not only that, but in the quieter moments it wasn't unusual for gentlemen on the way home from the pub to use them as a public convenience, so the smell would have been pretty awful too. 5. Trenches. These were probably the least popular of the lot. Councils dug these in parks and open spaces, and they were usually given a corrugated iron roof, although in the example pictured this wasn't always the case. These were very unpopular. People felt incredibly exposed in them. Not only that, but they were more expensive than you might think. They constantly needed digging out and draining, and constant maintenance were needed to keep them in any sort of working order. However, in the absence of anything better, if all you had nearby to you was a trench, you'd probably still dive in it rather than stay on the surface. Lastly, public basements. Large modern buildings like hotels had steel and concrete frames with deep basements. People felt safer in these than in surface shelters. Is there a particular shelter that I've ignored? Well, there might be a really obvious one. Underground stations. The fact is, initially people were forbidden from using underground stations as shelters, although it did later happen when rules were relaxed. So for the time being, I focused just upon the government-approved shelter types that existed at the start of the war. Your tasks then. Firstly, list the shelter types. Give one advantage and one disadvantage for each. Secondly, which types of shelter would have been the most affordable, A, for ordinary people, and B, for the government to provide. And 3, explain why the government favoured surface dispersed shelters. 4, what might have been the wider effects of shelters that were considered unsafe. Pause the video now and attempt those tasks. Okay, hopefully you've been able to identify advantages and disadvantages from the text. Make sure you've got at least one advantage and one disadvantage for each type. What types of shelter would have been most affordable for ordinary people? Well, communal and public service shelters and many basements were quite simply free of charge. Probably the next most affordable, other than the trenches, was an Anderson shelter, because if you were on low income, although you had to assemble them yourself, they could often be provided free of charge. What about for the government to provide? Well, again, using existing basements and public basements would have been the cheapest, and the domestic surface shelters too, which were built at the expense of individual families. They effectively did not cost the government very much at all. They might just need to be supplied and inspected. Probably the next cheapest would be things like the Anderson shelter, which were not assembled by the council but merely the parts provided. A considerable amount of effort and back-breaking labour was needed to construct one, but many people thought that this was worthwhile. What about why did the government favour these surface and dispersed shelters? Well, remember the issue of the government being afraid that at the end of an air raid, terrified people might not want to leave ones that are below ground. But also the more important and practical measure of dispersing them. If you had one large shelter and it got hit by one large bomb, that would be an awful lot of people killed in one accident. As we will see during some of the worst disasters of the Blitz, effectively that's what happened. And lastly, what might have been the wider effects of shelters that were considered unsafe? Very simply, people probably wouldn't have used them. And if they didn't use them, they would stay at home, and that would put them at even greater risk. So it was important for the government to sell the idea that these shelters were worth using in the event of air raids. Let's move on. An expensive necessity. In paper 1, there's every possibility that you could be given a source like this. It is reasonably unlikely you'll be given a source like this, but there's nothing in the rules that says that it can't happen. Source A is an account of the Aero Precaution Service of the St Pancras area of London, written in November 1945, i.e. after the war, by the chief ARP officer for the borough. St Pancras had a population of about 167,000 people at the start of the war. The source shows a list of the types of shelters available. These are ones that we've had a look at before. The number that were constructed or provided, the capacity of all those shelters that were provided, and the cost to the council of providing those shelters. So, there were 7,000 Anderson shelters provided with a capacity of 35,780 people. The cost of the council was £51,597. There were 2,456 basements with a capacity of 28,568. The cost was £34,186. Domestic surface shelters, of which there were 1,457, with a capacity for 7,634. That's 19,747. 303 communal surface shelters. There were 12,572 people that could have fitted in these, and they cost £63,990. Public basements numbered 186, with a capacity for 15,184 people, and a cost of £87,225. Trenches, there were 34 of those, with a capacity of 17,029 people, and they cost a whopping £128,000, and £21 at the end. Mind you, do remember that the trenches needed constant repair and maintenance throughout the war, and so their maintenance costs were probably higher than you'd expect. Public surface shelters, well, there were 79 of those with a capacity for 11,961 people at a cost of £60,423. I'll put my teeth back in, that's better. Morrison Shelters, 1,221 of those provided. Remember, those are the ones that could be used as a kitchen table during the day. They had a capacity of 2,952 people. Well, typically because you would rarely get more than about 2 people and 1 child in each one. And they had a cost of £1,239 in total. Given a complete total, that's 12,826 shelters with a capacity of 144,478 people, bearing in mind that the population at the start of the war was 167,000, and £446,428 in total. Blimey, that's a lot of facts and figures to read through. So you could be given some statistics as a source. You can treat these pretty much like any other source. So consider who made it, why, what info does it give you? Your tasks then. Note down content, own knowledge and purpose for the source A. Now remember, the content is what information does it give you, what own knowledge is linked to this, think about the previous activity we just did, and why did the council produce this? Overall, how useful are these statistics? Remember, real. Is it relevant? Is it enough? Can you trust the author? And are there any limitations? Thirdly, work out the cost per person of each shelter. So that's divide the cost by the capacity. And fourthly, how far would you agree that this source suggests that the government preferred to build and provide the cheaper shelters? Pause the video now and have a go at those tasks. It'll probably take you about 15 to 20 minutes. Done? Well, in terms of the content, it's given you the types and numbers of different shelters that were produced, how expensive they were for the council, and how many people they sheltered. How useful are these statistics? Well, I would argue really quite useful. Remember that they are relevant. It shows the numbers of types of shelters that were built during the Blitz. It provides us with enough information, certainly for the borough of St Pancras, but we could probably extend that to other typical London boroughs as well. What about the author? Well, it's been produced by the ARP organisation. If anyone's going to know this information, it would be them. And are there any limitations? Well, perhaps the biggest one is that it doesn't tell us how many people used these shelters. It just says that they were provided. Working out the cost per person, you'll have probably noticed that the trenches by some distance are the most expensive one. How far would this suggest that the source suggests the government preferred to build cheaper shelters? Well, not very. After all, the trenches were very, very expensive, and in fact some of the other really expensive ones, like the public basements and public surface shelters, which didn't have that big a capacity, were still very lavishly spent upon. It seems that at this time money wasn't really the object. The council just spent whatever money was needed. One final point. The pre-war population, or the start of the war population of 167,000 people, would not have been protected by the 144,478 capacity shelters. So what happened to the people who weren't protected? Well, some people just chose not to be protected. They decided to take their risks. But remember as well that the population in the area very likely decreased. Some people would have gone off to fight in the war. Others would have been children who would have been evacuated out of the cities, and some people would have moved away to take part in war industries. So it is likely that the 144,478 person capacity was very near, actually, everybody in the entire borough. We're now going to start interrogating or asking questions of sources. Check out source B to begin with. This is a photo taken in March 1939, so that's well before the war started. It shows families building their Anderson shelters in gardens in Islington, North London. Notice that one of the shelters is almost complete, with a woman just patting down the remainder of the earth embankment. The children look on. Next door, just behind the wall, another shelter is in an earlier stage of construction. There's also a little child's toy on top of the doorway there. Looks like it might be an elephant wearing a gas mask. However, we must focus on the relevant materials, not the irrelevant materials. I'm very sorry, that was a terrible joke. Here's an exam-style question. In paper 1 of the Edexcel exam, you will be expected to ask questions of sources. Now, lots of students find this quite a tricky task because they're so used to having to answer questions rather than ask them, and they can get quite confused. However, with a bit of practice, these questions are really quite simple and should represent some of the easiest 4 marks that you'll get. Study source B. How could you follow up source B to find out more about the provision of air raid shelters in London? So you've got to ask a question that's going to help you find out more about the provision of shelters, and you've got to ask something that's related to source B. In your answer, you must give the question that you'd ask and the type of source that you could use. That's a typo there, sorry about that. So you're going to complete a table like this. Obviously, you'll need to write that out with more space, but actually in the exam, you would be provided with a table in which to write your answers. Detail in source B I would follow up, question I would ask, what type of source I could use, and how might this answer my question. So here's an example. The man bolting the shelter together. That's the detail that you might use. The question you could ask is were the shelters delivered as kits? And then the source you could use would be diaries. Why? Because people might have described how the shelters were assembled. Do you need to know the answer to the question you're going to ask? Well, you absolutely do not know. Equally though, you are very welcome to ask a question that you do know the answer to. The examiner is not asking you to demonstrate that. Have a go at this now. You can follow my example if you like, but try and pick another detail, ask another question and consider a different type of source. Pause the video while you have a go at this, but definitely don't spend any longer than about 5 minutes on it. Okay, let's consider another detail that we could pick. I'm going to choose the example of the woman patting down the earth bank. The question I could ask would be, were people expected to build these shelters themselves? What source could I use? Well, I could have a look at government documents which might suggest whether there were workmen or handymen provided to help people put these kits together. And how might this answer our question? Well, it might give me the relevant detail as to whether the council was simply providing the kits or providing the labour force to put them together as well. Simple, really. 1 mark for each part, 4 marks in total. Now let's consider photographs as propaganda. There's source B again. Here's source C, a photograph showing mothers and children leaving a school in Ilford after being fitted with gas masks, September 1938. Bear in mind that's a year before World War II began. Remember, propaganda is like an advert for ideas, trying to sell a particular belief. Study sources B and C. They could both have been propaganda images. A, what would be the propaganda message of each? And what details in the photos make you think that would be the intended message? 2. Note down the following statements and label them either true, false or partly true? Explain the label you give them. Firstly, gas masks were only issued after war broke out. The government wanted the cheapest air raid shelters. And London was well prepared when war broke out in 1939. Pause the video now and attempt those questions. You might want to spend between 15 and 20 minutes on this. Okay, what did you come up with? So what might be the propaganda message of source B? Well, perhaps the message is that families were making preparations to protect themselves in the event of air raid, and that other people should do likewise. Perhaps the message of source C is that these people are getting well prepared and taking the safe option of getting their gas masks. They don't look particularly distressed by it, so it shouldn't be a stressful activity. Details in the source that suggest this? Well, we can infer that these are families putting together these shelters. Perhaps we can infer that the two women are the wives of the two men in the other photograph, and these are neighbours who are helping each other out with their children. What about the detail in source C? Well, look at the people smiling, with the gas mask fitting here sign behind them. It is quite clearly a school in the background as well. Look at the signs above the gate. What about these statements? Gas masks were only issued after the war broke out. That is false. Source C is produced a year before the war broke out, and so that can't be true. The government wanted the cheapest air raid shelters. That is false too. Well, consider the amount of money that was spent on quite expensive shelters like communal service shelters and indeed the trenches. And London was well prepared when war broke out in 1939. Well, that's more a matter of interpretation, but I think it might be safe to call it partly true. There were a lot of air raid shelters that were given out to people before the start of the war, and indeed the gas masks were a sensible precaution even though they weren't needed. Combine that with knowledge of ARP organisations that you may have looked at in another lesson, and if you haven't, I do urge you to do so. And we've got London, which is pretty well prepared, but still not really having much idea of what the air raids would entail. And of course, next time we have a look at one of these lessons, we will have a look at what happened when the bombs actually began to drop. Finally, note down as many forms of shelter as you can in 1 minute. You can time yourself. Secondly, give a specific example of an unpopular shelter. 30 seconds should be sufficient for that. And then sum up how well sheltered Londoners were in one word. Pause the video and have a go at that. Well, the shelters that you might have come up with include Anderson, Morrison, public surface, basements, public basements. You might have included the London Underground, and you might have included private service shelters as well, not to mention the one pictured, shelters. A specific example of an unpopular shelter might have included the shelters, but remember that public service shelters were felt to be very exposed and insecure too. Sum up how well shelters were in one word. Well, I'm sure you'd come up with something. But I might choose the word partially. Londoners were quite well protected, but it was not clear how often people would actually want to use these shelters in the real thing. And on that note, we'll conclude the lesson. I'll say thanks very much, and if it's been useful, please like the video and consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you and goodbye.